Yes, good morning, everyone. Good to see you all here and also at home on Zoom. We appreciate you all coming, and I think we'll have a marvelous session today. Just a couple of things. There are handouts in the back, and if you want to remember about last week, we did give you a sheet listing all of the coming up plant sales. So that, I think there are some more copies of that back there, but of course the spring is always a busy, busy time, to say the least. Just one addition to that, for the Wilmot plant sale, which is coming up on Friday, April 14th and April 15th, they do have a pre-order time for, I believe, azaleas, camellias, and a few other plants, which I don't remember right now. But if you call the number that's on the sheet and talk to Courtney, she can tell you more about that pre-order. And I believe the deadline on that is the 6th of April, which is next week sometime, the end of next week, I think. So, think about that. And I think there have been some emails that have come out about that, and also it's been in the paper. Today, just to get you moving, to look at some other gardens, there's a sheet back there called Gardens in North Central Florida, and there is, it's hard to do this with, I need another hand, sort of like when I cut the cat's front. Oh, thank you.
Which one are you reading?
Yeah, it's fine. Thank you, Julianne. I need you when the cat needs his claws clipped, because I can do the front claws, but I can't get the back ones. I need that other hand sort of coming out somewhere, which I really don't want. Yeah, and within a couple hours drive, there's also a long list of all of the places where you can buy things that relate to gardens, of course. So today we have quite an exciting program for you. We have the Logans here, both Logans, who've been a really important part of our lives here at Oak Hammock. They've been very involved with our residence council and many committees. They keep things going. When we had the whole COVID scare, Henri was in charge of making sure that the people who volunteered for the study that we had, the CDC study, she made sure that we all swabbed our noses every Tuesday morning. My nose is still lonely because I don't do that anymore. But anyway, Nelson has been very involved with not just that, but with sort of the keeping us all together here, I guess, and moving us forward in many different ways. So today we're going to have Nelson telling us about bonsai. And I think you'll find it fascinating, and we have some beautiful plants here. And then Henri will be telling us about orchids, which are also beautiful. So I'm going to turn this over now to Nelson, and he's right here. So Nelson, come on up.
Thank you. Am I on?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Maybe pull the mic a little towards your mouth.
A little closer. Oh, is that better? Okay. Can you get me started?
So many things to remember.
Yeah. I started doing bonsai perhaps 25 or 30 years ago. And I started out with what I learned later was simply small trees in pots. They weren't really bonsai. And I'll make that distinction in a moment. But Bonsai is a Japanese word that can be translated several ways, including tree plantings. And in American English, it's sort of pronounced as bonsai. And it's the Japanese version of the original traditional Chinese art of pinching. And pinching had to do with creating natural sceneries in a landscape form. And it started with monks, as you probably know, being garden people, something toward 3,000 years ago with monks. And it was a contemplative kind of activity that they were involved with. The Japanese monks picked it up, and we went from a landscape. This particular plant is in a stone or flat tray, and it is the tray itself is about 3/4 of an inch tall. The tray is about 16 inches long, and the landscape is about something short of a foot, 12 inches tall. And so, and the whole idea is to make it very natural looking. And if you'll see trees in the forest, you'll see these areas, open areas in the tree, and euphemistically we call it, it's where the birds fly. So when you create these things, you're looking for making places where the birds fly. The Japanese, on the other hand, the bonsai, were mostly about single trees. Of course, now, some 2,000 years later, and bonsai are used all over the world. Everything is everything, but the Japanese started off with single plants. And again, this is a plant that's in about a 6-inch pot and is less than 16 inches tall. Made in pads to make it look very natural. And believe it or not, this is the same tree, same species of tree. And if you remove the surrounding sky and sea and land and pot, you couldn't tell the difference between the two, which is the one that is 25 feet tall and which is the one that is 10 inches tall. So the idea is you mimic nature. That's what a bonsai is mimicking nature. So that if you didn't have the perspective of all the around, you couldn't tell that the bonsai from the natural tree. And if you were to take that tree that's in the right side and plant it out in nature in the appropriate environment, it in fact would end up to be a big tree like this. Here's another example, same tree, same species of tree. And if you didn't have the background and the pot and all of that, you wouldn't be able to tell which is the 40-foot tree and which is the 14-inch tree. That's a bonsai. No, they're not. And now it's a natural arrangement, and we in the question in Q&A we're probably going to address that. You defoliate these trees, and the new ones come out that are smaller, and that's a whole subject in itself. It's a good question. Oh yes, the question is that in the bonsai, are the leaves the same size as the one on the left? And the answer would be, under normal circumstances, yes. But the way it's cultivated and the way the leaves are defoliated over time, they stay small. They stay small. But if you just let it go, it would be big. This is a maple, I do believe. So, and it started out, all of the bonsais were done simply for the contemplation of the viewer. And so that monks would sit with these trees that they would cultivate, contemplating the things they do in life. And virtually any plant could be made into a bonsai. Now, I don't know about the giant sequoias and some of those, but virtually everything else. And our bonsai collection outside in the gardens, you can see that there are a lot of plants there that in fact were dug up around Okemuk and turned into bonsai. Bonsai come in traditionally about 9 different sizes, all the way from little ones to something bigger. And then they have some that are even bigger than that. And I have some examples here with those middle sizes. Now they have Japanese names, which I cannot pronounce. And so I won't attempt to do so. And I think that there's no definitions for them anymore, but they're the names that are used internationally. But you can see anything that mimics nature, that's the idea. So you take a specimen like on the left side here, and you get it in a nursery, and you can then style it. And the picture on the right is not a very good one, but you begin to see how if you look inside that tree, pull it apart, you begin to see where the tree is inside, and then you trim away everything else to reveal the tree that could be. And that's what the bonsai is. And so one last comment, and then this is the end of the presentation, except I'll say something about those plants, is that it's not dwarfing. If you take any of these plants, for example, this is a hackberry. If we were to take that out and plant it out here in the forest, in 30 years, it would be 40 feet tall. This plant. So it's not dwarfing, it's simply by controlling root size and trimming limbs and the like, you mimic the big tree while remaining small. So all of these, and this is the ficus that is a microcopy of ficus. It may be a Benjamin, I'm not sure, but I'm turning this in, I'm cultivating this to look like a banyan tree. And I have it wired here, so forth, to get a bit more spread. And sometime in the next month or so, I'll take these wires off, and the limbs will stay. This is a triangulata ficus, and the reason I brought it is that ficus is a very ancient tree, been around since forever, and the thing that's unique about them is that those ancient trees, of which ficus is an example, this is the fruit. These are the figs. It's the fig tree that we eat. It's also a ficus. These little figs on here grow on the branches. They don't grow like apples on the end of a stem, or an orange, or any of the fruits that we eat. So that on the branches, you see this. If I used too much time? Okay. And I try to show some little ones. This is a fucun tea, which is a tropical plant. There's beautiful little white flowers, and has 1 or 2 on here. This happens to actually belong to Nancy Wood, but I had her bring it so we could see that we have different sizes also. But and the way we talk about them is that one-handed pots and two-handed pots. It's not exactly Japanese, but it's easier for me to understand that way. Anyway, it's enough of that. Thank you.
Does anyone have questions? Okay, let me make sure to bring the microphone to you so everyone at home can hear you.
Nelson, is there a group devoted to the Chinese, the Was it Penjang or,
Penjing,
yeah.
is there?
Is there a group devoted to that as enthusiastic as those devoted to bonsai?
Well, in China, clearly.
Okay.
But of course, as I pointed out, is that as it has become more worldwide, everybody does everything. But the Chinese traditionally have leaned towards, lean towards these landscapes. And there's some magnificent ones. And they even use little figurines and so forth to make it look even more realistic. It's amazing what they can do. Yes.
Just verifying, do all your pots have holes in the bottom, drainage holes?
Oh, yes. Well, I hate, I can't do that, but there's typically two kinds of holes. One is one or two, or sometimes three holes about the size of a quarter that you put a little screen over so that the gravel doesn't go through. And as for drainage, and I'll talk about that in just a second. The other are some small holes where wires go through, because all of these trees, the big ones, especially, but even the little ones, yours is wired in too. The little ones, they're actually wired into the pot. And the reason is that the roots don't want to move around. And so that if you have a really good wiring, you can pick up the pot with the tree. And I could do that with these other guys, but I'm not strong enough with one hand to do it, so I won't do that. And I did this slowly to make sure I didn't screw it up too bad. See, yeah. And these are repotted about every 1 to 3 years, depending upon. They're not planted in garden soil. They're in a kind of gravel. Akadama. It's a Japanese kind of gravel. And then the reason is that you want the water to drain through. You don't want the roots to sit into water. And you want to, but it holds moisture for the roots. And that's why, depending on if it's in the full sun, you have to water them virtually every day or every other day. And then you fertilize them every 2 or 3 or 4 weeks during the growing season. So that's why people use watering systems and what have you. Or in our case, we have a bunch of people here who are involved with bonsai. So we take turns watering bonsai outside.
Those are spectacular. I'm curious about the one in the middle with the roots. Are those roots the result of the way the plant grows, or your manipulation, or half and half?
It's the plant. The plant puts out these air roots, and they will turn, and they do that for seeking water, and then they eventually end up to be a part of the trunk. And that's why if you see these giant banyan trees, let's say in India, the diameter of these things can be 30 feet, huge. And in South Florida, people would have banyan trees in their yards. They didn't want those area roots, they cut them off. Hurricane comes through and takes the tree out because the tree uses those for their trunk along with the water. So, don't.
And then we'll do a commercial break.
Okay.
Hi, thank you. I have two quick questions. One's a yes or no, and the other is because I don't know that much about bonsai. First of all, that first maple that you showed us, if that were subject to cool weather, the leaves would turn, correct? Okay. Also, could you explain a little bit about how you control root growth?
Yes. For an example, I did this one this year in about December. and you take it out of the pot, and there are some bigger roots that are growing, and the bigger roots you take off because the little hair roots is where the tree gets its nutrients. And then, so you take off perhaps somewhere between 25 to 30% of the roots as they hang down, and you put it back into the pot. Well, and you do that about every 1 to 3 years, again, on the size of the plant. Some really big plants, you might do it every 5 years because it grows slowly. But soon, if you start to see any roots around the edge, time to, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Nelson, I have a question.
Yeah.
Before you were showing me the one plant in the back, I believe it's Edna's, and it's growing on a rock,
Yeah.
no soil. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
There's no soil here at all, none. It is on a rock, and there's some, we call it muck. It's kind of a clay, a mixture, and it really is a matter of sticking it to the rock. And sometimes you will drill holes in the rock to tie the plant to that rock so it doesn't move around. Again, when you have something like this, you have to water it every day. But we have some pretty good sized plants on this size that are out there on rocks. And that's all there is. It's just the rock and the plant. And if you would go to the mountains and you sometimes see a rock and you see this tree coming out of it, that's the mimic.
Nelson, could you say something about miniaturizing the leaves? Because that's a fascinating process.
And there are some that miniaturize more easily than others. The triangulata doesn't very handily, but in the ficus, for example, they want to have bigger leaves so that in about a month, I'll take all the leaves off this tree, peel them all off. And in about a week, they'll come back and they'll be smaller. And so with many trees, you do that. Now, of course, the easiest ones is you can select a plant that has naturally small leaves. For example, I have a small miniature jade tree, a jade plant that I've turned into a tree. And it naturally has very small, not the big fat ones that you can see from Lowe's or someplace you buy these, but they're little ones. And so I don't have to do anything with it because they're just naturally small. But if you defoliate it, the leaves that come in will be smaller.
I have an announcement too, and Nelson can tell you more about it later. This afternoon, he has a group coming in from, I believe, Shands to meet him over here. Meet him here. Okay. Yeah, but then they're going to go over to our gardens where you can see the plants in the big cages that they have over there. So you all are invited. This is a perk. And at 1 o'clock, you can come here or you can go over to the garden a little bit later and have him talk about the plants over there. So let me get this over here.
As Mary White and Nancy and others here know that about the garden, there's lots more plants over there besides these few here. They're kind of fun to look at, some of them.
So put that in your calendar. And now while Henri's getting ready, she's just about ready here. I just wanted to tell you a little story about something in my life. I've been a gardener for a long time, not always successfully and not specialized, but I had a house in Pennsylvania, a summer home that I've now sold. And in the front, we had a stone that we actually bought, but on it, it said, "I'm not old, I just need to be repotted." So, but the stone disappeared in the move, so that's a sad story. Anyway, here is Henri Logan, and she's going to tell us about these beautiful orchids and her work with orchids. And then we can have questions after that too. And if you have more questions for Nelson or anybody, we can do that. Okay, Henri?
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Henri Logan, and I'm going to talk about a love affair with orchids. So I first, like a lot of women of my age, saw orchids in magazines, and maybe the bride had an orchid that came out of her bouquet, and I was enamored with orchids, but they were not attainable to this kid who grew up on the dirt road in Kansas. And so it was one of those things that it was sort of hung around in the back of my mind forever. And then I had the opportunity, because Nelson's mother lived in Hawaii, to actually see and experience orchids, and it furthered my love affair. And so then I had the opportunity to actually grow them. And I had a small greenhouse in Iowa City, and I had a chance to fall in love with ones that are my very, very favorites, which are these huge corsage orchids called Cattleya. And this one is an example of Mother Nature doesn't intend to do that with bonsais, nor this with orchids. And so we do a lot of work to make them be small and manageable, because this one is my George King Serendipity. And over here is an example of George King that needs desperately to be repotted, because Mother Nature wants those roots to hang out and get all the nutrients from the air. And so I can talk a little bit about that in a little bit. Orchids come in all sizes and shapes. There are 28,000 known species of orchids. That's mind-blowing. So Jan Lowenthal calls me a dabbler, and she's exactly right, because I go to a show and I look for something that appeals to me, because with 28,000, and about 2/3 of them grow in tropical climes, many of them in the cloud forests. So the nice thing about orchids is you can pursue it from the scientific point of view. You can clone them, you can hybridize them, you can climb mountains and look for them, or you can be like me and just be a dabbler. And I want to tell you a little bit about my life as a dabbler. This one is this is a very old-fashioned one. It dates back to about the 50s for sure. And its parent is called the Irene Finney. And the Irene Finney is one of the first ones that I had when I lived in Iowa City and had. This is not the same one from that. I was not lucky enough to move from Iowa to Florida and have all my orchids survive. They just said, wait a minute, it's really hot and humid down there. We're not sure about this. But anyhow, this is the Irene Finney. And I fell in love with Cattleyas, I think, largely because they're so flamboyant and exotic, of course, colorful, because they come in every color you can imagine, except black and blue. And they're romantic. Who could forget the orchid corsages? Beautiful and unattainable. I love this story. I used to take my orchids over to skilled nursing, and John Schaefer looked at that and said, I remember being 17 and it cost me $25 to get a corsage, an orchid corsage for my date. I never was lucky enough to have an orchid corsage, but it worked out okay. It did. It worked out okay. So this one is and I always have to remember the names of them because they don't flow off my tongue. This is a French variety that also dates back into probably the early 60s, and it's called Colmanat aux Tuileries. And it is also a very old, you remember the industrialists had greenhouses and conservatories in England, and they would do a lot of things to try to make it work in England when they found them in the tropics. I can't imagine the challenge of trying to make that. But so many of these date back to a long time. Most of these are hybridized, and so they will have parent stock. And I only give you the name of the parent stock because I'm not one of those people who wants to keep track generation after generation. I grow them for only one reason, and that's the flowers. And I'm very honest about it. So I'll show you another one. This is one of my very favorite ones that every year it's a very faithful bloomer, and it's called the Volcano Queen. And you will often find, we live on the 4th floor in building 1, and we often have them out on our ledge outside our apartment, or perhaps on the buffet by the double elevators. So when you're out and about, just walk up and see what might be there. This one, I think, is such a spectacular color. And over in the greenhouse, I will often go over and find little tiny frogs sitting on the lips. And it's such a joy because they're catching little bugs. And my goodness, do we have a lot of pests over in the greenhouse. So the question is, I've shown you these big things, but there are 28,000. This is also an orchid. And I brought it along. It grows in dirt. And it's not nearly so spectacular. But on the other hand, when you get it to rebloom, you go, wow, that was something really unusual. And this is one. And I've never been able to win a prize for my cattleyas because all the big growers, and they have better conditions than we do. But I won a first prize for my strange little plant. This is a closer to a native species, and I got it from a grower in California who's trying to save some of the original species. So you can see that you can have the gamut of things. If you like the flamboyant and exotic, if you like the little bit more unusual, and there are many, many, many others in between. So where do I get my orchids? That's always the question. Someone came to me the other day and said, I'd like to have those great big corsage orchids too. Where do you get them? Well, I'm going to say something about our local resources here. Of course, you can buy the Phalaenopsis at Lowe's, Home Depot, grocery stores. And those are sometimes called the moth orchids. Some of them are big, some of them are small, and they have been bred so that they come in every color, and they're very inexpensive. And so anybody can have an orchid like that. You can try to rebloom them, or you can treat them like a bouquet of flowers and just throw them away and go buy another one. So then there are the orchid shows, and I'm going to say something about one that's upcoming here in Gainesville that I hope you'll all attend. And then between here and Tampa and between here and Orlando, there are growers and their nurseries in huge abundance. And you can go buy, and some of them are open to the public, so you can actually buy them. Some are only commercials, but those resources are available. And that's where you begin to see the enormity of the orchid species. Over in our greenhouse here, we have Rhonda Smith grows many, many vandas. She brought many of them up from South Florida, and they're all hanging with those long, long finger roots hanging down. And up at the very top, you'll see these clusters of beautiful colors, some small, some large. So even in our greenhouse, you can see that I have a little epiphyte that is blooming also. So variety. And with 28,000, there's bound to be something that everybody can make grow if they just want to. The Gainesville Orchid Society is a local resource that I hope you'll all say a little bit more about it. And then there's the International American Orchid Society. And if you want to copy down those websites or just Google American Orchid Society, it will come up. And they have resources for people who are new growers. The local resources, the Gainesville Orchid Society meets at Kanapaha Botanical Gardens, which I know that you all know about and talk about. And that's the last Monday of every month. And they also have a gazebo that has an orchid display, which is maintained by the Gainesville Orchid Society. And there are beautiful things. Orchids, some orchids are seasonal, some will bloom year round. So you will see a great variety, and some that grow in the ground and some that grow in different medium. Some bark, some prefer like little lava rocks. So there's even a huge variety in the ways that you cultivate these beautiful, beautiful flowers. There is in the Gainesville Orchid Society a beginner's class at every session at 6:30. And they often are addressing an individual species that you might find to be interesting, and also talking about the kinds of things you need to do to make it grow. There are greenhouse tours that are sponsored by the Gainesville Orchid Society. And those they're always in the area, and you go, wow, I didn't even know this greenhouse was here. And you will see flowers that just take your breath away. These are beautiful, but some of them will be even bigger than that. And then we have a members auction. This Monday night, there is an auction in which the individual members will have, because orchids grow and you have to divide them, they will be auctioning off. They may not be in bloom, but they'll have a picture. And they sell for anywhere from $20 to $70. So depending on what you're interested in buying. Garden Gate Nursery is probably one of the best local facilities. The people at Lowe's and Home Depot know a little bit about orchids, but very little. But at Garden Gate Nursery, they know a great deal more. And they also have things that come directly from Hawaii. And what comes from at Lowe's, I don't know, someplace in Florida, by the truckloads, they bring them in. And the Gainesville Orchid Show, October 21 and 22 at Kanapaha Gardens. And it's open, free, and you can just go out there. And vendors come in from all over Florida, and you can take a look at all the different things that they have. And you can say, well, I'm an experienced grower, and I have these conditions. And they'll say, well, that's nice, but you may have trouble with that. Or this is a wonderful species for you, and this will work. And they generally stand behind their plants too. So October 21 and 22 at Kanapaha is a place you don't want to miss if you're interested in orchids at all. The American Orchid Society is another resource, and they have something. There's a membership and magazines, and Richard Farwell, who lives here, is very, very active in the American Orchid Society and cloned beautiful orchids when he was in South Florida. So he can tell you more about it, but any of these, you Google the name and it will come up, and you can learn how to become a member of that. The thing that I like most about the American Orchid Society is that they have, whoopsie, I'm gonna go back here. They have online chats. And so you can say, my orchid has, as many of these, this on them. What do you think it is? And they're so willing to give you information about it. And they'll suggest various ways that you can manage it. These are true experts that are so giving of their time and interest. And the other thing that I have found enormously helpful to me is something that they call culture sheets. Let's say I give you a Cattleya and you say, I don't know what this is. And so you'll look at the label and then you'll get a culture sheet, which tells you about the conditions that you need. How much light do you need? How much water does it need? How much fertilizer and what kind? Is it 30, 15, 10? At what times of the year? So it's a resource of information that I think is just so helpful. Me, I'm a dabbler and I do trial and error. But occasionally to try to get an expert to tell me what's really going to make it grow is really, really useful. So I will stop there and just point out that this plant, and I want you to see all these horrible looking roots out here, but it's so happy and it produces flowers. And this is the first one that I showed you. This is serendipity. But this year I got to bite the bullet and I have to repot it. And I will probably cut it up in about 3 pieces. And I always want to contain the roots because I don't think they're beautiful. And I'll put them in a pot with new bark. And then I'll fertilize about once a month to try to get it. And I'll put root stimulant on it to get it to put the kind of roots out that I want it to put out. So it's a love affair with the orchids and Mother Nature, who has better ideas of how to do this than I do. But she tolerates me, and my goal is to just stay out of the way so Mother Nature can do her thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Henri. Do we have questions? I shall be back there.
Remember on Zoom, if you have any questions, let us know.
First of all, a big thank you. I live on the same floor as she does, and I can't tell you how much we appreciate the flowers and the orchids that you put outside your door. They're gorgeous.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Henri,
And it's fun to share.
Henri, can you scoot more toward the center so our Zoomers can enjoy
Yeah.
seeing you? Mm-hmm.
Which orchids have the longest bloom time? That the bloom will stay looking good for the longest?
Within the various species, there will be a lot of distinctions. One of the ones that is just finishing up blooming out in the greenhouse is a dendrobium called Comet King. And it sends out long, ugly plant stalks. And then every single place on there, it will get a flower. And that one will last at least 2.5 months. But that's probably the one that I have that lasts the longest. Most, like the cattleyas that I try to bring up to our 4th floor, they'll look good for a couple weeks. And then like the one that I just exchanged is over in the greenhouse, and it doesn't look terrible, but it's certainly not in show condition. So that's kind of the range.
Other questions?
I have one. Back here.
Where are you? Where are you?
Henri, I'm back here. That's okay. You don't have to turn. You
Go
can
ahead,
face the
Julia.
camera. In our greenhouse here, how many species do all of you residents have?
Well, that's a good, I'm going to start out by saying there's probably about 40 that do pretty well in Florida. That would be my guess. I kind of tried to do a little research on that. Out in our greenhouse, of course, there's lots of Phalaenopsis because those are the ones that are the most common. And people can bloom them with reasonable ease. But there will be Cattleyas and Dendrobiums and lots of Vandas and lots of Oncidiums. So those are the main ones we have out there. There are a few more exotic and unusual ones. And most of the time, those come from the raffles at the Gainesville Orchid Society, because you go in there and somebody will have a plant and you'll buy a raffle ticket and you'll get it and you go, wow, I've never seen anything like this before. So I suppose there might be 7 or 8.
Other questions?
Is this something that we can do on our porches, or do you have to have a greenhouse?
That's a great question. The Phalaenopsis, before they became so popular, were called windowsill orchids. And they will do pretty well. And when I was still at UF, one of my offices that I had a north exposure, and I could raise incredible orchids there. So if you can raise them in Shands Hospital, then you're doing great. And it's all about the light. And the question about whether you can raise them in your apartment or your house or your porch is all about how much light. The culture sheets will tell you how much light. The orchids adjust well to the watering, but they don't adjust well to light. They won't bloom. You'll have foliage, but they won't bloom. The cattleyas that I raise require the highest amount of light. Vandas also require high amount of light. So I don't think I could raise the cattleyas in our apartment, even though we have probably one of the lightest of all apartments. I think it needs to be outside. But the Phalaenopsis you can do almost any place.
Thank you, Henri.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that both Henri and Logan would welcome you coming up to look at their specimens a little closer and ask some.
Well, one of the things
questions.
that I think you maybe pests, what do you do about pests? Because I happen to know that Nelson's bonsai have pest problems, as do orchids. One of the biggest problems is scale, and they do well in our greenhouse, but they can be controlled, but it takes diligence. And maybe you want to say something about how you control yours. Mine, I take them outside because Mother Nature has creatures out there that will help me control it. So that's the glory of taking the things outside in the summertime.
Well, the short version is that I use a granular systemic, and that works pretty well. If I have a real bad infestation, then I go to the killer stuff and I use 7.
And that doesn't work with orchids.
But I only use that in dire straits, because the granular systemic seems to do a pretty good job for me.
And the difference in what he's saying is because the bonsai take their nutrients from the soil or the fertilizer, but that's not where orchids get theirs. So it's a different problem, and we have to do different things to control them. The oils are probably what you have to do with orchids, to put them on the leaves, and that takes diligence, because what you're doing is basically suffocating them as they hatch.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Come on up and take a look.
Yeah,
if you'd
and
like.
remember that this afternoon, Nelson will be on again, and you're welcome. At any time that you want to go over to our gardens and see what we have over there. If you haven't been there, you've missed an opportunity. So next week, we will have Mark Frank here. He's the extension botanist for the University of Florida, IFAS, and he will be talking about house plants. He's a very good speaker, and I think you'll enjoy him very much. So now, if there are no more questions, come on up and look at these beautiful plants and flowers that we have, and we'll see you here next week. Thank you for coming.